From the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Hanover Tower, the city looked like a map someone had laid out just for him, with the river curling through the lights, the bridge cutting across the dark water like a silver scar, the neighborhood spreading out in every direction, and the tiny cars that crept along the streets so far below that they seemed more like pieces on a board than people with lives, which was exactly why, most evenings long after everyone else had gone home, Ethan Walker stood at those vast floor-to-ceiling windows and tried to convince himself that from this height the world was manageable and orderly and safely under control. If you want to see how one small letter explodes that illusion and rewires a man's entire life, make sure you stay with this story. And before we go any further, remember to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because what happens after this quiet moment in the glass office will not be what you expect. At 38, Ethan had already spent 6 years as CEO of Walker & Co. Furnishings, the company his father had built from a tiny shop into a multi-state manufacturer of high-end furniture that now employed more than 2,000 people across 3 different states. And on paper, it was everything a board of directors could want: profitable, stable, expanding into new markets, admired in industry magazines, and spoken of with respect at conferences, which meant that investors slept well and the analysts who tracked the company rarely worried, while the man at the top quietly realized that this business had become almost the only thing left in his life. His wife, Hannah, had died 3 years earlier, taken by a sudden, vicious kind of cancer that moved through her body with terrifying speed, stripping 8 months out of their lives from diagnosis to final breath. And because they had never had children, when she was gone, the silence in their house felt so large and echoing that Ethan started coming into the office earlier and leaving later, until his assistant stopped asking if he had evening plans, and the cleaning crew learned to vacuum around him without comment. And the only way he knew how to survive was to pack every hour with work until grief had no empty corners to seep into, no quiet spaces to fill. The office became his home, the business became his family, and that gleaming corner office, with its sweeping view over the city, became his refuge, his throne, and his cage, all at the same time, and on a raw, mid-December evening, exactly 2 weeks before Christmas, when the sky was already black by 5 and frost crept along the edges of the glass, someone knocked on the heavy door. "Mr. Walker, the late mail just came up, and there's something a bit unusual in it," his executive assistant said as she stepped into the room, her voice as steady as ever, which mattered because Patricia Hayes, in her 50s and famously unflappable, almost never used that word in connection with office paperwork. So the moment she did, Ethan felt a thread of curiosity tug him away from the contract he had been marking up with his pen. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the document for a moment longer before glancing up, and Patricia, who had seen every kind of corporate correspondence over 3 decades in this building, held out a small white envelope and said, "A letter addressed to Santa at the corner office, Hanover Tower, delivered through our regular business mail, sir." The envelope was the kind sold in bulk packs at drug stores, a child-sized rectangle with a slightly crooked stamp in the corner, and an address written in careful but uneven handwriting that tried very hard to be grown up. And when Ethan took it from her, he noticed that the return address listed an apartment in a worn industrial neighborhood not far from one of their largest production facilities, which made something inside him tighten even before he slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside, on a page ripped neatly from an elementary school notebook, blue lines faint under large pencil letters, was a letter that made the office feel colder and the city beyond the glass feel suddenly much closer. Dear Santa, my name is Lily Miller, and I am 6 years old. It began, the letters slightly crooked but determined. My teacher said you live at the North Pole, but my mom said you live in the corner office of the big building downtown. She said you make decisions about people's lives from up there. And as Ethan read those words, he heard his breath catch, because whoever Lily's mother was, she understood more about power than most executives he met at conferences. Santa, my mom works at the furniture factory. She works really hard, but she is so tired all the time. She cries sometimes when she thinks I am asleep because we do not have enough money for things. The heat in our apartment does not work good, and it is very cold for Christmas. I do not want toys. I want my mom to not be so sad and tired. I want her to not cry. I want our apartment to be warm. My mom's name is Sarah Miller. She works in Section C at the factory. Can you help us, Santa love? Lily, P.S. I have been very good this year. I help my mom and I do my homework, and I do not complain even when I am cold. At the bottom of the page, in colorful crayons pressed hard into the paper, there was a drawing of a tall tower with windows stacked to the sky and a small stick figure in the top corner labeled Santa in shaky capitals. And as Ethan read the letter once, then again, then a third time, something that had been numbed for years began to ache in his chest in a way he did not quite know how to handle. Sir, are you all right? Patricia asked quietly, standing just inside the door, as if unsure whether she should retreat and leave him alone or stay in case he needed something. And Ethan, still looking at the letter, said, "Find out who Sarah Miller is, please. Pull her employee file, and I want to know her situation in as much detail as we can get." An hour later, when the winter sky outside the glass had turned the color of slate and the city glittered under streetlights and headlights, Patricia came back with a thin manila folder and laid it gently on his desk, explaining that Sarah Miller, 32 years old, had been working at their primary manufacturing facility for 4 years, that she was a full-time assembly line worker and a single mother, widowed after a car accident had taken her husband, with an excellent employment record, no disciplinary notes, and only one absence beyond standard sick days, a week taken 2 years earlier when her daughter had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and that her salary, like everyone else in her position, was $34,000 a year. Ethan stared at the number on the page and did the mental math automatically, factoring in the cost of living in their already expensive city, the rent on even a modest apartment, childcare, food, transportation, and the grim reality that for a woman raising a child alone on that income, survival would not be a metaphor, but a daily calculation, a balancing act between utility bills and groceries, between heating and medicine, between exhaustion and the need to keep going no matter what. The return address on the envelope, he said, tapping the top corner of Lily's letter. That building is part of the Riverside Courts complex, isn't it? And Patricia, who seemed surprised he recognized it, nodded and said that the Riverside Courts had earned a reputation over the years for faulty heating systems and a landlord who ignored repairs unless threatened with legal action, which meant that if the heat had gone out there again, no one should be surprised. Ethan stood up, the leather chair rolling slightly back from his desk, and in that moment he felt a decision settle into place with a clarity he had not felt in years. So he said, "I want the company car brought around to the front entrance." And when Patricia blinked and glanced at the clock on his wall, saying, "Sir, it is just after 7 in the evening," he shook his head and replied, "I know exactly what time it is, and I am going to deliver a Christmas gift." What he did not yet know was that the short drive he was about to take from the top of Hanover Tower to a cold little apartment on the west side would redraw the entire map of his life. So before we walk with him down that hallway and knock on that door, take a second to hit the like button, share this story with someone who thinks small actions do not matter, and subscribe, because this is the moment everything begins to turn. On the way to Riverside Courts, Ethan asked the driver to stop at 3 different places. First, at an appliance store where he bought several sturdy electric space heaters rated for small apartments. Then at a grocery store where he moved mechanically through the aisles, filling a cart with basic staples, fresh food, and a few treats he thought a child might like. And finally, at a toy store where he stood for a long, uncertain moment surrounded by shelves of dolls and games and colorful boxes before picking out a soft stuffed bear with a red scarf, telling himself that even a 6-year-old who claimed not to want toys probably deserved at least one. The Riverside Courts complex rose in front of him like a weary brick monument to deferred maintenance. The stairwells dimly lit, the paint inside the entrance chipped and faded, and as he climbed to the 3rd floor and found apartment 3C balancing the awkward armful of packages and bags, he realized with a jolt of unfamiliar nervousness that he had faced hostile investors and skeptical journalists without breaking a sweat. Yet somehow the prospect of knocking on this door and meeting the woman behind that letter made his heart pound in his chest. When the door finally opened, it revealed a young woman with light brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, wearing worn jeans and a stretch sweater, her face pretty in a way that exhaustion could not entirely erase, and in her arms she held a small girl with tangled hair the color of dark honey and large, serious eyes, a child who was wearing a red coat inside the apartment, which told Ethan more about the broken heating system than any written complaint ever could, because even from the doorway he could feel the chill coiled in the air. The woman, Sarah Miller, looked from his expensive coat to the shopping bags and boxes in his hands, and he saw wariness move over her expression like a shadow as she said, "Can I help you?" Her voice tight, and Ethan cleared his throat before answering, "Mrs. Miller, my name is Ethan Walker, and I am the CEO of Walker & Co. Furnishings," which made her face lose color so fast he wondered if she might faint. "Oh God, did I do something wrong? Am I being fired, please?" "I really need this job," she blurted, clutching her daughter a little tighter, as if she could shield the child from whatever blow might be coming. And Ethan shook his head quickly and said, "No, absolutely not. This is not about you being in trouble. I am here because I received a letter from your daughter." And as he spoke, the little girl peered at him from behind her mother's shoulder with wide eyes that seemed to hold equal parts fear and curiosity. "May I come in for a moment just to explain?" he asked, keeping his tone as gentle as he could. And after a brief hesitation, Sarah stepped back and opened the door wider, allowing him to step into an apartment that was tiny but painfully neat, every surface carefully organized, with a small artificial Christmas tree in one corner, decorated with handmade paper ornaments and strands of popcorn, and underneath the festive effort, the air that felt almost as cold as the December night outside. "Lily wrote me a letter," Ethan said, reaching into his coat and pulling out the folded notebook paper. "She addressed it to Santa at the corner office." And as he spoke, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and she whispered, "Oh my God, Lily, what did you do?" While the child shrank slightly behind her, her small fingers gripping the back of her mother's sweater. "You said Santa lives in the corner office. You said he decides things from way up high," Lily protested in a small but fierce voice, and Sarah, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, turned back to Ethan and said, "I was trying to explain how companies work." She was confused because her teacher was talking about Santa at the North Pole, and she kept asking who really decides things. So I said that CEOs sit in corner offices and make decisions that affect people's lives, and I guess she took that literally and thought she could write to you. I am so sorry. She is 6. She does not really understand. "I think she understands more than any of us want to admit," Ethan replied, his voice softening as he knelt down so he was closer to Lily's eye level, the paper still in his hand, and he added, "Lily, your letter was very brave, and I think your mom is right. People in corner offices are a little bit like Santa in the sense that we are supposed to pay attention to what people need and try to make sure they are taken care of," which made the little girl study his face with unsettling seriousness before asking, "Are you Santa then, really?" "I am not Santa, but I am someone who can help, and that is exactly why I came here tonight," he said. And for the next hour, the man who usually measured time in meetings and quarterly reports moved around a cramped apartment, setting up space heaters that began to push back the chill almost immediately, stacking groceries into a refrigerator that had been nearly empty, handing Lily the stuffed bear, and watching her entire face light up with such unfiltered joy that his throat tightened, and sitting at a small kitchen table, talking to Sarah about her work, her schedule, the bruising realities of her life. "I am doing the best I can," she said finally, speaking in a low voice while Lily sat on the threadbare rug in the living room, introducing her new bear to the few other toys she owned. "I know it is not enough. I know she deserves more than this. But when my husband died 4 years ago, I was suddenly alone with a baby and a pile of bills, and I have been trying ever since to keep us afloat. I just keep telling myself that if I can hold everything together for a few more years, maybe it will get easier. But I am tired in a way I do not know how to fix." "You are doing far more than enough," Ethan said, feeling anger rise inside him, not at her, but at the invisible system that squeezed people like her until they broke. "You work full-time on a physically demanding job. You raise your daughter. You keep this place going. And the fact that it feels impossible is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that the system you are stuck in is failing you. And Sarah gave a short, bitter laugh and replied, "That is very easy for you to say from your corner office," before her eyes widened and she rushed to add, "I am sorry, that was rude. I did not mean it like that." "It was honest and you're right," Ethan said after a moment, and he was surprised to hear how tired his own voice sounded. "To tell you the truth, my wife died 3 years ago. We did not have children, and I handled it by working all the time, by hiding in that corner office you told her about, and from 42 floors up, I make decisions that affect thousands of people. But somewhere along the way, I lost touch with what those decisions actually mean in an apartment like this, on nights like this, for people like you and Lily." And he looked over to where the little girl sat, hugging the bear, while the new heaters clicked softly, the room finally starting to feel bearably warm. "Your daughter's letter reminded me that there are real human beings behind every number in a spreadsheet, every salary figure, every policy we sign off on. People who get cold when landlords refuse to fix radiators, people who go without sleep to cover extra shifts, people whose kids write letters to Santa because they cannot see any other way to ask for help," he said, meeting Sarah's eyes and holding them. "I cannot fix everything tonight, and I will not insult you by pretending I can, but I can start doing the part that is mine, and I am going to." Over the next 2 weeks, while the city moved toward Christmas in its usual blur of traffic and decorations and year-end rush, Ethan set in motion a series of changes that would ripple far beyond one cold apartment, beginning with a comprehensive review of compensation across the company, with particular attention to single parents and lower-wage employees whose pay had quietly lagged behind rising costs, and continuing with the creation of an emergency assistance fund that employees could access when faced with crises like broken heating, medical emergencies, or unexpected financial shocks. A fund designed to offer help quickly. Instead of burying people under forms and delays, he personally called the landlord of Riverside Courts, who responded with evasions and empty promises. So Ethan did something he had never imagined himself doing. He instructed the company's legal team and real estate advisors to explore purchasing the entire complex, and within weeks Walker & Co. had acquired the building, hired reputable contractors to overhaul the ancient heating system from top to bottom, and established a small on-site office where tenants could register maintenance issues and actually expect them to be addressed by people who answered the phone. At the same time, he asked human resources to pull deeper data on employee well-being, scheduling a series of listening sessions at their facilities, and out of those conversations emerged an idea that crystallized around one person, Sarah Miller, whom he invited back to the downtown headquarters for a meeting that made her twist her hands together in the elevator and wonder aloud what she had done wrong, until he sat her down in a conference room and explained that he wanted to offer her a new position as an employee advocate liaison, working directly with HR and with him to identify worker needs, bring concerns forward, and help bridge the gap between the shop floor and the corner office. "I do not have the right credentials for anything like that," Sarah protested, shaking her head and staring at the offer letter as if it might vanish. "I do not have a degree. I have been on the line for years. I am just someone who punches in and does her job and prays she does not mess up. And I do not think I belong in meetings with people in suits. You have the most important credential of all, Ethan answered, leaning across the table. You have lived this. You understand what it feels like to try to pay rent on the wages we were offering, to worry about whether your child will be warm in winter, to feel invisible when decisions are made by people who never come down to the floor. And that perspective is something this company desperately needs, even if it does not fit neatly on a resume, because I need someone who will tell me what I do not want to hear when I start drifting back into the clouds. The pay increase attached to the role was substantial, enough to change the balance of her monthly calculations, and when Sarah finally accepted, tears running down her cheeks while she laughed with a kind of bewildered relief, Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he felt like he was using his position for something that mattered beyond another positive quarterly report, something that might justify, even a little, the responsibility that came with that glittering view from above. On Christmas Eve, when snow threatened the city and people hurried along the sidewalks with wrapped packages tucked under their arms, Ethan returned to Riverside Courts and knocked once more on the door of apartment 3C. And when Sarah answered, with Lily practically bouncing in place behind her, the difference in the apartment was striking. The air was warm, the little tree twinkled with a few new ornaments, and there were wrapped presents tucked under its branches, small but real, signs that this year would not be as bare as the last. I came to thank you, he said, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved awkwardly into his coat pockets. Both of you, for reminding me what actually matters and for dragging me back down to earth from that corner office. And Sarah shook her head and told him he did not have to do any of the things he had done, the new job, the changes, the building repairs, that none of it had been required. But Ethan answered, yes, I did, because your daughter was right when she believed that the person in the corner office should be paying attention and should be helping, and somewhere along the way I forgot how to do that. Lily tugged on the sleeve of his coat and asked with disarming bluntness, are you having Christmas with anyone, or are you just going back to your big glass office? And when Ethan admitted quietly that he would be alone because his family was gone and his closest friends were scattered with their own celebrations, the little girl frowned and declared that this was very sad and that he should have Christmas with them instead, at which point Sarah began to protest, saying she did not want to impose on his time, but Ethan surprised them both by saying that he would like that very much if they were sure. They spent Christmas Eve in that small living room, with Sarah cooking a simple but hearty dinner in the cramped kitchen while Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, helping Lily piece together a jigsaw puzzle, laughing when they had to search under the couch for missing pieces, and later they watched a Christmas movie on the old television, drank hot chocolate that Sarah apologized for as if it were not good enough, and talked in quiet, meandering conversations about nothing urgent and everything important. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan was not surrounded by spreadsheets and glowing monitors on Christmas Eve, but by warmth and human voices and the steady breathing of a child falling asleep on the couch. As the night wound down and Lily's head drooped against a cushion, Sarah looked over at Ethan and said softly, "Thank you for seeing us, not just stopping by, but really seeing us, because most people in your position drive past these buildings and never wonder who lives inside them." And Ethan, staring at the sleeping child, answered, "Thank you for writing that letter, or rather for letting your daughter send it, because she may have saved my life in a way she cannot possibly understand yet." In the months that followed, schedules shifted and roles evolved, and what had begun as gratitude on Sarah's part and a kind of solemn responsibility on Ethan's part slowly unfolded into a friendship built over shared stories, long conversations about grief and fear and resilience, and the steady presence of Lily, who appointed herself unofficial matchmaker and periodically announced, in the uncompromising way that only children have, that Ethan seemed very lonely when he was not with them, and that her mom smiled more on the days he visited. They moved carefully, each of them carrying the weight of a lost spouse and the understanding that love after loss was not a simple replacement, but something more complicated and fragile. So there were false starts and awkward pauses and moments when both of them wondered if they were doing the right thing for Lily. Yet 2 years after the letter addressed to Santa arrived at the corner office, Ethan stood once again in that same small apartment, now familiar and dear to him, holding a ring instead of grocery bags and heaters, and asked Sarah to marry him, not with some extravagant public spectacle, but in the very place where she had once opened the door to a stranger on a freezing night. "Your daughter wrote a letter to Santa in the corner office," he said, his voice unsteady despite all the speeches he had given in his life. And in doing so, she pulled a man who was drowning in grief and isolation back toward the surface. She reminded me that the view from the top does not matter at all if you are not paying attention to the people below. And I cannot imagine my life now without you and without her. So I am asking if you will marry me." And Sarah, her hands trembling, said yes with tears streaming down her face, while Lily, watching from the couch, clapped and cried at the same time. At the wedding, which took place in a small church decorated with winter flowers and attended by a mixture of factory workers, office staff, relatives, and people from the Riverside Courts building who had never expected to see their landlord's name on a wedding program, Lily served as flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle with exaggerated care, and during the reception she stood on a chair to reach the microphone and explained in her clear 8-year-old voice that she once thought Santa lived way up high in a corner office, which made the guests laugh, but that she had learned even people in tall buildings needed help sometimes and needed someone to remind them what really mattered, and that because of one letter she had gotten the best Christmas present ever, a real family. Years later, in a corner office that was still on the 42nd floor, but no longer felt like a cage, Ethan had Lily's original letter framed and hung on the wall where he could see it whenever he looked up from his desk. And although he still ran Walker & Co. and still dealt with budgets and strategies and expansions, he had learned to leave at reasonable hours, to show up for school concerts and family dinners, and to remember that every major decision he signed carried invisible faces with it, faces like Sarah's and Lily's and the hundreds of other employees whose lives were entangled with his choices. The view from the corner office did not change in any physical way. The river still cut through the city, the bridge still stretched across the water, the neighborhood still sprawled in every direction, and the cars still crawled along the streets like beads of light. Yet he saw it differently now, not as a field of assets and markets to be managed from a safe distance, but as a living community full of people, each carrying private struggles and quiet hopes and urgent needs, people who deserve to be seen and valued and cared for, people who sometimes needed someone in a high office to act less like a distant ruler, more like the Santa figure a 6-year-old had imagined, because the letter on his wall taught him something he refused to forget, that power without compassion becomes empty performance, that success without humanity turns hollow no matter how impressive the numbers look, and that some of the most important work any of us can do is to respond when someone asks for help, especially when that request comes in the form of a shaky note from a child who thinks the only way to fix her world is to send a plea to a stranger she calls Santa. And as you listen to this story, wherever you are and whatever kind of office you occupy, maybe high up or maybe not high at all, remember that each of us gets letters in different forms, small signs that someone nearby is struggling and brave enough to reach out. And the real question is whether we are willing to answer them and make the spaces around us a little warmer, a little kinder, and a little less cold. So if this story moved you even a little, do not forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness still changes lives, and subscribe so we can keep telling the kinds of stories that remind us what actually matters.